do a book together. We were just spending time running in the morning, as we often do when we're visiting each other, sharing ideas about our research, and we realized there were many connections between the environmental humanities and the type of cognitive psychology that he does, which has a social relevance, which engages with humanitarian and ecological issues. So some of the key ideas from this book, Numbers and Nerves, include the issue of psychic numbing. That is, how the human mind is often overwhelmed by large numbers. That we have what we might call a tragic insensitivity to large-scale phenomena. So you could say the more important an issue is in the world, a crisis of some kind, the less capable the human mind is to understand it. So we refer to this as a tragic insensitivity to large-scale phenomena. Also, the idea of pseudo-inefficacy, the psychology of feeling that if we can't help everyone in need, or we can't really solve a big problem, we shouldn't even try, because we fear that our efforts will be ineffective. But that's a false ineffectiveness, a pseudo-inefficacy. Also, the prominence effect leads us to easily be distracted from things that we care about, where we're debating between us responding to one problem or another problem, and we struggle to make the proper determination of the most serious issue we should be concerned with. Also, there's an asymmetry of trust when we receive information about certain issues in the world. It's very difficult for us to develop a sense of trust in experts in a particular field who are understanding the seriousness of a problem. It's all one person has to do is say, that's unlikely, or there's doubt about a phenomenon, and our trust is punctured. So it's asymmetrical, difficult to develop trust, and very easy to collapse or puncture trust. When I was in India, one of my visits back in 2006, I did meet with Vandana Shiva in New Delhi and spoke with her about the arithmetic of compassion. I was asking her about her style of communication when it comes to serious issues like the use of genetically modified seeds, or the taking of water from rural areas where farmers need that water. And she said that often people who don't want the public to care about a problem, they use lots of technical language, they use lots of numbing numerical information or data, and they achieve what she called the anesthesia of destruction. That's Vandana's phrase there. That often people who want us not to care about social phenomena or environmental phenomena, they numb us, they put us to sleep with data and jargon. And it's her purpose as a writer to break through the anesthesia of destruction. And then finally, I wanted to also to mention, there are many ideas in the book, Numbers and Nerves, but the idea of the trans-scalar imaginary, the way we struggle to move from individual phenomena, singular phenomena, to large-scale phenomena. In order to understand many issues in the world today, we need to think across scales, from the one to the many, from the small to the large. And certain writers, certain artists, such as someone named Chris Jordan, a writer, an artist, a digital composition artist and photographer from Seattle, Washington, attempt to train viewers and readers to think across scales in order to help us grapple with serious phenomena in the world. So this book deals with the psychology of insensitivity and how we might overcome it. So I wanted to mention that we did, a year after the book came out, we created a website And the URL for that website is www.arithmeticofcompassion.org. And many of the key ideas from numbers and nerves appear on this website in a very reduced and clarified way. So if any of this is of interest, and what I'm saying right now is not very clear, you can easily go to this website and look at some of these core ideas from the project there. Then just last week, we added environmental humanities material to the Arithmetic of Compassion website. And I wrote this material, an introduction to the environmental humanities, and then smaller introductions to 3 main ideas or aspects of the environmental humanities that are relevant to the numbers and nerves ideas. One is called slow violence. You can see at the bottom of the screen that the 3 ideas I've emphasized now on the website in the environmental humanities: slow violence, narrative empathy, and empirical eco-criticism.
Scott, I hope we can't see your screen.
You can't see my screen?
No,
Yeah.
not yet.
Oh. I'm trying to share it. Let me see. Oh, wait. Can you see it now?
No. Now it's fine. Yeah.
Can you see it?
Yeah, now we can see it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I wish you could have seen it. So this was my opening slide. A hand holding a single piece of plastic.
Yeah.
This is the slide showing the 2 books
Okay.
that I'm going to talk about: Numbers and Nerves, and then the idea of narrative scholarship from a book of mine called Going Away to Think.
Okay. Yeah, we can see that.
So I prepared the book Numbers and Nerves with my father, Paul Slovic, a psychology professor and one of the well-known scholars in the field of risk perception and decision-making, a cognitive psychologist.
Okay.
These are the core ideas that I just tried to describe to you: psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, the prominence effect, the asymmetry of trust, the idea that Dr. Shiva from India helped me think about, the anesthesia of destruction, and the trans-scalar imaginary. And here's the website that I was just describing, which is, we call it Arithmetic of Compassion, or www.arithmeticofcompassion.org, which really emerges from that book, Numbers and Nerves, and focuses on the application of the psychology of sensitivity and insensitivity in humanitarian and ecological contexts. I was also saying that we recently added the entire environmental humanities dimension to this website with a specific focus on slow violence, narrative empathy, and a new field within eco-criticism called empirical eco-criticism. And I'll explain what that is in a few minutes. So slow violence, there may be some of you at this conference who are using this concept in some of your work, but slow violence is a term that Rob Nixon, an eco-critic from Princeton University, made very popular and prominent in the field with his 2011 book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. And for me, one of the key ideas of slow violence is that there are certain types of threats in the world, certain dangerous, serious situations that are not spectacular, explosive, or cinematic. You make a movie of these phenomena very easily. These are like extinction, pop.
Scott, can you hear us?
Pretty.
Hello.
you hear? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now we can hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Here's the screen again.
Okay.
Oh wait. Sorry. So, can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can see it now. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's better now. But we lost the voice. Okay.
So, one of the key ideas for Rob is serious in the world are invisible or imperceptible to human senses. And that creates a terrible challenge for us. So for artists and writers, there's the issue of how to convey some of these serious phenomena to us that are so beyond our ordinary perception. These are imperceptible threats. Another idea from the Arithmetic of Compassion website is narrative empathy. The special power of story to compel attention and to help us care about phenomena. So in narrative theory, we refer to this as narrative empathy. Suzanne Keen is one of the well-known scholars in this area, but there are many environmental humanities scholars who are doing what we call eco-narratology and attempting to study the effects of story on the human mind, or cognitive eco-narratology is what they do. And then finally, empirical eco-criticism is a new branch, a very new field, just emerging right now as we speak within the field of eco-criticism. And as you can see from the bottom of the screen, if you can see the screen, and, this is a website created by Alexa Veit von Mosner, a German eco-critic who teaches in Austria. And empirical eco-criticism is a branch of the field that focuses on the empirically grounded study of environmental narrative in literature, film, television, etc., and the influence of environmental narrative on its audiences using the technique to story, to environmental. So there are psychologists like my father and others, and people in fields like journalism who study the power of individual stories as a way of conveying knowledge to the public about issues happening in society, like issues of mass suffering, the refugee crisis in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. But now eco-critics are actually studying the power of individual stories and other kinds of textual impacts, like our sensitivity to animals, and what can stories about animals do to make audiences care more about other species. These are the kinds of things that empirical eco-critics are now working on. And one of the, when my lecture is called Singularity, one of the issues that people are interested in is the singularity effect. How can single objects, single phenomena, break through the psychic numbing that we tend to feel when we face large-scale phenomena? So, some of the work, that our capacity to feel something or to care is limited. And that is, we tend to feel numb or to turn off our feeling when we're exposed to large-scale or difficult phenomena, such as genocide, such as devastating poverty, such as a huge ecological crisis. We become numb, and it's a coping mechanism, a way to help us grapple with these phenomena that can be overwhelming, but it also becomes problematic because it prevents us from responding appropriately and sometimes improving or correcting these phenomena. So look at this screen, these two graphs. When you ask, what is the value of a human life? You know, what is the value of each human life? Well, in a normative context, an abstract context, you might say every human life is of the same value. Look at this graph on the left. One human life equals 1 unit of value. 2 human lives should equal 2 units of value. This is the way we should feel about the value of a human life. But in reality, the psychologists who study the extent to which we care about lives find that already from 1 life to 2 lives, we stop caring. We care a little bit less for that second life. And by the time we're talking about 10 lives, or 100 lives, or 1,000 lives, each human life means less and less. So this is a model based on empirical research by psychologists that shows the diminished sensitivity human beings have as the number n grows large. It's called psychophysical numbing. And what it means is that as soon as we're talking about 2 phenomena, we're not really caring as much as we would be about 1 phenomenon. And the singularity effect is that single phenomenon, that one character in a novel or a story or an essay or in an image, a photograph, that single phenomenon moves us in a way that multiple phenomena do not. So here are these images, terrible and disturbing images from the news media, illustrate this very graphically. On the left, you see an image from The Economist magazine from April 2015 of Syrian refugees on a capsized boat in the Aegean Sea. Numerous images like this appeared in international media about the refugee crisis in the Middle East, and there was very little public response. However, this one image on the right appeared in the New York Times in September 2015 and captivated the world. There was a tremendous response to this single tragic image of a young child who had been trying to escape the humanitarian crisis in Syria and go to Turkey. So if you look at these Google statistics, Google search statistics, you see that there was very little attention on Google to the refugees crisis or to Syria, and no attention at all to the name Aylan. The name of that small child is Aylan Kurdi. There was no attention, very little attention even to the crisis. And then when that one image appeared in a prominent forum, the New York Times, this huge spike of attention. And after a month or so, people were no longer searching for Aylan Kurdi, but they were continuing to pay attention to refugees and to Syria. And this is just a brief and small way of showing the extreme interest in these social phenomena that occurred after that image appeared in the media. And also you can see that philanthropic giving to Syrian refugees greatly increased after that image appeared in the media. So what I'm interested in as an environmental humanities scholar is what you might call poignancy. What does it mean to compellingly present information? And how can poignancy have a powerful emotional effect? And I want to ask, what makes a text poignant? In a way, I think this is what many of us, literary critics and humanities scholars more generally, are interested in. How can we prick the audience to pay attention to a phenomenon that they might otherwise not care so much about? So let's take the issue of plastic as an example. It's not hard to look at a single plastic bag and recognize it and imagine what it can be useful for and what kind of problems it could cause. That ag is just thrown away in the world. But think about the large-scale phenomenon of the huge gyres of plastic waste that are swirling in the world's oceans. The diagram on the right shows these enormous plastic gyres in all of the world's large seas. How do we get our heads around that phenomenon? And also on a microscopic scale, what's known as the microplastic problem. It's very hard for us to grasp these minute phenomena in the world. The oceans are full of this kind of plastic, which is terribly upsetting the ecology of the world's oceans and has all kinds of implications. It's a vast problem, and it's very abstract for us as humans to perceive. Well, one of the artists that I study is this photographer and digital composition artist, Chris Jordan, who's interested in the trans-scalar imaginary. So this is a picture of Chris Jordan in his art studio in Seattle, Washington. And these are the computers that he does his work on, and the printer where he prints his large-scale works of art. You can also visit his website at www.chrisjordan.com to see the kinds of projects that he works on. He's particularly interested in helping his viewers move from the one to the many, the individual to the collective. So very quickly, this is one of his well-known images. It's called Plastic Bottles 2007. Every one of his images in a series of compositions called Running the Numbers has a caption attached to it. The caption here is, "This depicts 2 million plastic beverage bottles, the number used in the United States every 5 minutes. At least in 2007, that was the statistic. So you look at this image, and it looks like an abstract design. You can't really see what these objects are. It could be a sandy beach or something. Yeah. It looks really pleasing and not disturbing. But when you walk up close to the image, you see that it actually consists of 2 million of these plastic bottles, like the ones that many people use in their daily lives. And it illustrates what 2 million bottles looks like. It helps us to realize that one bottle, that single bottle that we might be holding in our hands, is part of a much larger collective phenomenon. And so the purpose of this type of visual composition is to help viewer think across scales, what's called the trans-scalar imaginary, understanding how single bottles connect to a large-scale issue. So for the book Numbers and Nerves, I visited Chris Jordan just as I visited Vandana Shiva in Delhi. I went to Chris Jordan's studio and interviewed him about the way we are insensitive to large-scale numbers and how he seeks in his art to compel us to make the connection between individual phenomena and multiple phenomena. And he told the story of a friend of his who was looking at this composition in an art museum while holding a plastic bottle of water. And as he was holding this one bottle and looking at this large image, it occurred to him that the screen represented 2 million one bottles, and he finally understood the meaning of this screen. So I'm working right now on a book of my own that I'm calling Singularity, and what I'm doing is studying the way audiences react to various texts. I'm using 3 primary texts: an op-ed written by a well-known writer from Alaska named Richard Nelson about oil spills. I'm looking at Aldo Leopold's classic essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, and I'm also using Chris Jordan's composition Plastic Bottles 2007, and I'm testing the audience, exposing them to different types of images or different passages from these pieces of writing in order to see the way they react. So, for instance, Richard Nelson's in 1989 response in the Los Angeles Times to one of the largest oil spills in the United States at the time off the coast of Santa Barbara. He was actually reacting in '89 to the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska. And in his small essay, he begins by giving us an overview of what Prince William Sound in Alaska is like, the enormous ecological vitality of that place. But it's very general on a very large scale. But in the center of his essay, he tells about a single bird that he found during an oil spill. This is a picture for you of a western grebe that's been found in an oil spill. This is exactly what he's describing here. He talked about encountering one bird in a puddle of oil. He says, "I have forgotten how many barrels of oil went into that earlier oil spill in the Santa Barbara Channel, how much it cost to clean up the spill, how those who suffered damages were compensated. One memory is lodged forever in my mind, a single dying bird, her feathers matted and shining with oil, her wings drooped, her body quivering. She stared up at me, blinking her bright red eyes, the one part of her that still seemed fully alive. Caught in that bird's unwavering gaze, I could not escape my own feelings of guilt." So what I'm interested in is to share little pieces of text with experimental subjects, either general description of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, or sometimes just this description of a single bird caught in an oil spill, and then share with other experimental subjects the two types of text, the overview and the single narrative image together, in order to see whether the audience responds differently to questions about oil spills and about large-scale phenomena and small-scale phenomena. What I want to test is the way textual priming, exposure to a particular type of text, will change the way audiences react to policy questions, public policy questions, and emotional questions about oil spills. I also am interested in Aldo Leopold's famous text, Thinking Like a Mountain, which is about predators in ecosystems. I don't know, I think there may be certain types of wolves in some parts of India, but I also know that there are tigers in certain areas like the Sundarbans and various other regions. So the question of predators in ecosystems exists in many parts of the world, not only the American West, where we do continue to talk about wolves and the implication of having wolves in our natural places. So Leopold is writing about wolves in the American Southwest, particularly Arizona and New Mexico, in the early part of the 20th century. And I think Aldo Leopold understood intuitively the idea of the transscalar imaginary. He knew the power of the individual narrative in addition to abstract ecological explanation and analysis. So what I want to do with this small essay by Aldo Leopold, Thinking Like a Mountain, is take it apart and expose audiences to different parts of the essay, such as this paragraph. The paragraph on your screen right now, this paragraph may be the single most famous paragraph in American environmental literature. It's about how Leopold and his partner shot a pack of wolves that they encountered when they were checking out a natural area. And as he hit a few of the wolves with his bullets, and he walked up to an older wolf just as she was dying and saw the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. And as he watched this wolf die, he sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain itself appreciated the idea that fewer wolves meant more deer, and that it would be healthier for the environment to have fewer predators. So he tells this individual story in a very moving and visible and emotional way. Then the next paragraph in Leopold's essay expands to a larger ecological context. He has since seen many states remove predators from their natural areas, and as a result, entire ecosystems have been devastated because there's an overpopulation of deer and other animals that would have been hunted by the predators. So basically, Leopold is demonstrating the trans-imaginary intuitively. He published this in 1949, long before scholars and other artists were using the term trans-scalar imaginary. But what I'd like to do is actually test audiences to see how they respond to this type of scaled-up language, abstract ecological language, and then singular narratives. And then what happens when they read them together as they were presented in the actual text, and how does that affect audiences' ability to think across scales. So I'm almost at the end of my prepared remarks, but I want to talk a little bit about narrative scholarship. So in the early 1990s, when I was a beginning scholar, it occurred to me that an effective way of presenting my own studies of environmental literature would be not only to analyze the textual material in a formal, traditional, scholarly way, but to tell my own story as a human being living in the world, either as the primary focus of an essay, or as an intermittent strategy, like at the beginning or the end of an essay, that there could be a type of poignancy, even in academic writing, a way to make academic writing more interesting and engaging, more emotionally moving, by including my human story in that text. I published a little essay in 1994 called Storytelling, called Eco-Criticism, Storytelling, Values, Communication, Contact, in which I made the argument for narrative scholarship. And I said storytelling is a way of making our own writing more emotionally poignant for our audiences, even when we're writing in a scholarly way. I said we should realize, as critics and teachers of literature, that literary expression challenges and directs readers to decide what in the world is meaningful and important to them, and that by using narrative, we might encourage our own readers to think about questions of meaning and values, about their own lives in the context of the world. I have a personal ethos as a scholar where it's important for me to try to communicate as clearly and directly as I can. And I don't know how clearly my ideas are coming through right now in this lecture across the world. But normally, when I speak, or when I say, my hope is to try to say something directly and not with a kind of obscurity or inaccessible formality. And then finally, another principle of narrative scholarship is the idea that we need to understand our place in the world. We need to think about our lives not only as academics working in libraries or in academic buildings, but actually the fact that we're doing work as scholars in direct contact with the world itself. In fact, as I explained in this essay, this piece called Eco-Criticism, Storytelling, Values, Communication, and Contact, when I was a Fulbright scholar myself in Japan many years ago, I went to visit a famous Japanese farmer and writer named Fukuoka Masanobu, who was one of the gurus of Japanese organic farming. And I was a young professor at the time. I was teaching at the University of Tokyo, a very elegant and formal Japanese academic institution. And I came out to the countryside on the island of Shikoku to visit this rural farm of Professor or Dr. Fukuoka. And I said to him through an interpreter, do you think scholars have anything to contribute to our understanding of the relationship between human beings and the natural world? And he seemed to ignore me. He didn't look at me directly, but he said, listen to the nightingale, listen to the bird outside of the little hut where we were sitting and drinking tea. And his assistant leaned over to me and whispered in my ear, he means, if you pay attention to the world, then you might have something to contribute to our thinking about this important relationship between humans and nature. Pay attention to the world, not only to academic discussion, not only to the things that you read in journals or in books, or that you hear at conferences, but to the world itself. And so for me, narrative scholarship is a way for environmental humanities scholars to be thinking about their lives in the world, even as they talk about academic and more abstract phenomena. So I showed you in my first slide that image of a single piece of plastic, but really that plastic has a context, that it's not just anyone's hand. That was my own hand holding the plastic during a visit to spend some time with my wife, who was working last year in Southern California. But while running along the beach in Crystal Cove State Park near Irvine, California, I found many pieces of plastic. And picking up these pieces of plastic helped me to understand that actually even a seemingly beautiful natural place is full of these objects of our industrial culture. And in fact, the entire ocean out beyond where I'm standing on the beach is littered with pieces of plastic that seabirds and fish and sea mammals are attempting, where they're attempting to live their lives. So if I were to write a small article based on this lecture, telling you a little bit about numbers and nerves and about empirical eco-criticism and narrative scholarship, I would probably begin and end the article with the story of my own visit to a beach, picking up pieces of plastic and providing a narrative context out of my own life as a way of helping you to pay attention to this single phenomenon, or how these single objects are related to a much larger phenomenon. I would also try to give you the broader setting, the physical context. This is where the story is taking place. It's not just an abstract piece of plastic sitting there in some anonymous hand, but a single human being living in the world, running along a beach, picking up pieces of plastic, and this is what he's encountering. And I believe by telling this story, I might help you to think about your own encounters with plastic in your own lives, and the utility, the abundance, this vast scale of this plastic pollution problem, which is not an American problem, not an Indian problem, it's a human problem. Around the world, when we're using these plastic objects, we are contributing to a very serious ecological problem, one of many that our species has caused in the world, and that we should be thinking about as we attempt to limit the damage of our impact on the world. So all of this work, even the little story that I told you about visiting California and finding pieces of plastic, this is work related to the efficacy, the effectiveness of environmental communication. And perhaps some of you are also thinking about this in your own research. If I were there with you in Rajamundry, I would be interested in learning about the kinds of texts that that you're studying, what are the most poignant or impactful ways of communicating environmental information to the public and to policy makers. These are issues that I've been studying for many years, since the 1980s. And more recently, I've been trying to do this with working not only with psychologists, using the ideas of psychologists, but actually incorporating social science techniques, research techniques into my own work as a humanities scholar, testing audiences to determine what the impacts of different types of texts might be. So is this right? This is my last slide. I'm interested in what are the most poignant ways to communicate environmental information to the public and to policymakers. And this work is leading me into the interdisciplinary realm of what we call empirical eco-criticism. So thank you for giving me a chance to share these ideas with you. Much of this is available online. If you just go back to that website that I showed you at the very beginning of my talk, you can find a lot of this information here. I hope what I've just told you makes some sense and is of interest, but you can also have access to these ideas through the internet. And you're very welcome also to contact me. My email is here at the bottom of this first page. And I know some of you may have a few questions right now, but you're also welcome to reach out to me through email and share some ideas or ask me any questions. So thank you for your attention, and I hope the Skype worked well enough for me to share these ideas with you. Thank you.
Scott, did you hear my students applauding you?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, that was a wonderful lecture, and really we are missing your presence here, and we are looking forward to your arrival sometime next year or so into Rajahmundry, and I'm sure my students have so many individual stories to share with you. Could you hear this?
Did you want to do that right now? That would be fine with me.
Yeah, if there are some stories, yes. In fact, I myself did one. I have my colleague, a friend of mine, a geologist, and we both made a study of a small river which flows in the West Godavari district, the neighboring district. So that is the river's name is Errakalva. We call it Errakalva. So we studied it from its origin to the confluence point of the ocean. So how it got polluted and how there was a dam across it and how a lot of plastic garbage is being thrown into the river, how it is being polluted. We spoke with some of the farmers there, some of the fishermen there, and they narrated their stories. I mean, I really was so struck with your lecture that what we are doing exactly here, you are already theorizing it in your book, Numbers and Nerves. So thank you very much.
Also, can I say something about that? Actually, I didn't include it in my lecture, but in a longer version of this lecture, I would talk about the issue of personal testimony.
Okay.
Testimony. So there's a very powerful movement in conveying citizens' concern about various phenomena, which we refer to as the testimony movement. In the United States, often this is related to wilderness. When you want to show how important wild places are to the public, you gather up the stories of people who care about these places and you collect them in a book. And then I actually have entire lectures focusing on testimony, these collections. Or you can use a website to present the stories of people who know about these places, who live there, who care about them, who've seen them change after a dam was built or after a factory was built, and who want to tell their stories. So I think we as scholars and teachers have the potential to work with local citizens to give them confidence to use their voices to tell stories We can also create films or videos of individuals who may not even use written language very comfortably, but who can talk about their experience and tell moving stories about their lives. So I think collecting testimony and finding appropriate ways to represent this testimony for larger audiences can help to expand the attention to these phenomena, such as the river you were describing. If there's a way of improving the social conditions and the ecological conditions of that river through changes in public policy, a testimony project like that could be effective, and someone like you would be a good person to lead that type of effort.
Exactly, that's what we are doing. Tomorrow, Rajendra Singh is going to release that video, and once it is released, I will share that video with you also. And
wonderful.
It's a documentary that was made, and it took us almost a month or so to study the whole river from its origin to the confluence point. So,
wonderful.
Here, Krishna would like to speak to you.
Thank you.
Scott, thank you so much for your presentation. That was really amazing. So I actually think of myself as, I'm a fiction writer, so I think of myself more of a storyteller than a scholar. So I'm especially interested in your idea of the emotional poignancy. But I'm curious, what your research has been in terms of if a story is emotionally resonant, if that actually affects the reader or viewer to take action. What relation does emotion have to actually doing something about it?
So there are actually a number of scholarly works that study that specifically, either in the field of psychology or in the humanities. And for instance, there's someone who named R.J. Zajonc, Z-A-J-O-N-C, who studies the psychology of attention in relation to action. So first of all, storytelling that moves an audience might compel the audience to pay attention, simply to pay attention. And what Zajonc and others have tried to study is whether when we pay attention, we might be compelled to actually act upon that attention. And there are various conditions of storytelling that might encourage or impede action. And one of the issues is, well, after you break through the numbness, you make people pay attention and care, might they still feel that their action would be ineffective? This is the concern of pseudo-inefficacy. When people realize that there's a phenomenon that is occurring, whether it's plastic pollution or the destruction of a river system, people might easily be overwhelmed and feel as if they can't even make a dent in the problem, so why try? That's why to have some narratives that demonstrate the willingness of an individual to engage with that problem are particularly compelling. Rather than just showing and creating an awareness of the phenomenon, to tell stories that actually show people overcoming pseudo-inefficacy and actively engaging. A great example of such a story would be the story of the writer and activist Wangari Maathai from Kenya, who tells the story of the hummingbird responding to the forest fire. So the story that Wangari Maathai always used to tell audiences as a way of motivating them to take action was that a tremendous fire was occurring in a forest fire, and a small hummingbird began dipping its bill in water and dropping these tiny droplets of water on the fire. And when other animals in the forest asked the bird, "Why are you doing that? You're not having any effect." And the bird said, "I'm doing the best I can." This is all I can do. This is the size of my beak, and I'm going to react and engage. A tremendously moving story that immediately impacted audiences to think, you know what, I'm one small person. I have limited power, but I will use my power to do the best I can. So, and not all stories are alike, and stories that show a willingness to engage, a hopefulness, in spite of all the odds, are particularly inspiring. But actually, to tell you the truth, we're really just studying the effects of different types of narratives right now using these empirical techniques. So I think some of this assumption about the impacts of particular types of stories is a little bit speculative, based on our own feelings as we read stories and how we imagine broader audiences responding. And what we need to do is collect more empirical data about the way different types of stories that are presented in humanitarian and ecological contexts, how do these stories affect audiences differently, different types of audiences, different types of texts. So that's one of the purposes of empirical eco-criticism, to answer exactly what your question is in a more, I would say, more substantial and more fully, how should I put it, well, an empirically validated way. So right now, some of this is speculative, based on what we understand from our own reading of these stories, but not necessarily on thoroughly empirical methodologies. So this, stay tuned for more results in a few years. A lot of scholars, many young scholars in the environmental humanities, are enthusiastically engaging with this new empirical approach, which builds on the interdisciplinary hopes that this discipline has had for many years. Since the beginning, we were hoping to bring fields together and at least use vocabularies from other disciplines. But now, through this empirical methodology, eco-critics are actively using these social science techniques in a way that I think is going to revolutionize the field. Do any of the students have questions?
Yeah, please. Yeah, come from. No, you can come here. Yeah.
Hello. So you were saying something about how you were going to take these narratives to policymakers. Have you already done that? And if so, what is the response to it been?
Yeah, thank you. So I presented a lecture at a large conference on environmental law about a year and a half ago, specifically discussing the importance of bringing narrative into the language of policy, public policy, and environmental law as a way of compelling the people who are employing this work to pay more attention to legal issues related to environmental construction. And actually, I was using, in my lecture, using the work of someone named Charles Wilkinson, a prominent environmental lawyer, who makes these arguments specifically about the power of story in natural resource law. So Wilkinson, a professor at the University of Colorado, has actively used narrative or story in an environmental legal context, because he said this is what makes lawmakers care. When people propose a new law, that they include human language, or what he calls bright words, because he says this language tells politicians and others to care about the phenomena that are being described. Also, I would say that I wish I had included a slide for a small article that I published a few weeks ago about examples of particular cases where storytelling is helping policymakers pay attention to an issue that they might otherwise not care about. Let's see, I didn't mention this in my article, but one of my books from about 15 years ago is on wilderness in the state of Nevada, where I used to live. And I worked with a national park ranger to create one of these testimony collections to compel government officials to pay attention to the importance of protecting wilderness in that state. And we created a book of testimony called Wild Nevada, Testimonies on Behalf of the Desert. And that did receive a lot of attention from government officials within that state. So I can't actually say that a particular law was changed in my state, but there was attention drawn to the issue. As I'm answering the question, I'm remembering another example of an actual book called Testimony, which was compiled by the famous American environmental writer Terry Tempest Williams and her colleague Stephen Trimble. It's simply called Testimony, and it was created as a special edition about protecting public land in the state of Utah. And it was not published for the general public initially. It was simply produced as a small booklet and given to every member of the American Senate and House of Representatives in order to lead them to care about protecting the beautiful land of southern Utah, beautiful desert land. And actually, a new law was created, a new national monument called Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument during the regime of the administration of President Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol building with this book called Testimony, and he said, "This book made a difference." He actually said, this book helped us pay attention and protect this land and keep it from being developed for oil and gas exploration. So the President of the United States actually stated that a book of testimonies made a difference and led to the protection of land. So that made the shining example of how a book of testimonies made a difference. And in various other efforts, it's a little bit less clear, the specific connection between the stories and the policy. But I do think, at the very least, the stories help people to pay attention and care about these phenomena, these places, these people. And caring and paying attention are the first steps toward taking action. But again, this is the kind of thing that could be studied in an Indian context, in an American context. In what ways do different types of texts make a difference? Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Scott. That's a wonderful way. I mean, maybe testimony to what you are mentioning now. Hope we'll have some more testimonies, and the policymakers will listen to those testimonies and change it.
Yeah.
So that's a wonderful way of putting it. Any more questions, please? I remember Shelley's quote, "Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world," perhaps. I think poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Yes, maybe testimonies will also be, in a way, indirectly affect or influence the policy of the lawmakers.
And that's a wonderful quotation to use. And even if we're not making policy, our work as poets, as storytellers, as scholars of poetry and story, our work is relevant to policy.
Exactly.
I think that's part of what I'm trying to say. We may not be the legislators, but our thinking is relevant to legislation. And it's important. I think we now have some of the tools in order to convey that conferences like yours, that our work can help legislators and general citizens to think about the meaning of their lives in the world and how we might all work together to improve our societies and respond to problems that we're facing.
Yes, that's right. I think, well, what is it? Is it a direct question? Yes. So Scott, thank you very much. I think my students here have enjoyed your lecture very much, and I hope tomorrow we can see some more environmentalists coming, and maybe they can correct some more testimonies also. It's really very inspiring. Okay. And I hope.
Thank you, sir.
I thank you, and if you can share your PowerPoint, the points, maybe tomorrow we can further explain that to our students. Maybe you can email
Okay,
us your
I'll try to do that.
Yeah.
I'll try to do that.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
No, we should thank you. We woke you up in the middle of the night, and you and you really woke us up from numbness, a sort of environmental numbness that we are all in. So by waking up there, you woke up us into something. Thank you very
I
much.
hope so. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody. Have a good day.